and welcome to this edition of Lift Every Voice. Lift Every Voice is a program by the NAACP Louisville branch in which we seek to bring information to the community regarding the issues on which the NAACP is working and on which the NAACP is concerned. As you well know, we're an agency fighting for the civil rights, human rights, educational rights, economic rights of all individuals regardless of race, and that is what we're all about. Today, I want to talk about the JCPS student assignment plan, because we're currently in the process of looking at student assignment again in terms of where it needs to go and what needs to happen. I think in order to properly understand and put all of the discussion we're going to have in context, I'd like to give you a little historical stroll through the years in terms of what we've done and how we arrive at this point where we are. Beginning in 1975, the NAACP, along with several other organizations, filed lawsuit against the Jefferson County Public Schools as well as the Louisville Independent School System, primarily rooted in the absence of equitable rights, equitable education for both African Americans and other minority members in our community. That lawsuit resulted in a desegregation order by the District Court Judge Gordon, in which he ordered that the county school system and the city school system be merged, along with several other things. Getting to that point was very difficult, and the period beginning in 1975 was very difficult for this community. Very difficult in terms of because the city school system, which was predominantly African American, and the county school system, which was predominantly white, most of the resources that were supporting the school system had moved to the suburbs. And so this was a program, a change in terms of trying to get equitable funding for education to ensure that African Americans received and got a quality education. Needless to say, many segments of the community rejected that idea, primarily white citizens of this community, rioted, protested, and did everything they could to prevent this from occurring. And they undertook several activities. Would you believe it, when we talk about what had happened in the most recent public demonstration as it relates to Breonna Taylor and how some people in the community have talked about how the demonstrators have acted, you don't hear much people reflect back on what happened in 1975 and 1976 when the white community rose up in opposition, or segments of the white community rose up in opposition to desegregation. We, in fact, had busing taking place when students from West Louisville were, in fact, bussed out into the suburbs. And believe it or not, there were armed National Guardsmen who had to ride the buses with those students to get them to schools. We had service stations across the county who would not sell gas to JCPS to gas up the buses and a number of things. So there was outright, for lack of a better word, rebellion against what was taking place. But it was all designed to, in fact, move us forward, move us ahead to get something done as it relates to school desegregation and the education of African Americans. Go ahead a few years and we go to 1984 when there was a review of the student assignment, student selection plan. And at that time, there was in fact a limitation and change in regards to ending mandatory busing for the east end and southern sections of the town. So that meant that individuals who lived in the suburbs were no longer primarily white, were no longer being bused into schools in the inner city, and they were able to go to schools closer to their home and to their neighborhood. This was also a time when, in fact, magnet schools came into existence. And magnet schools were put there to, in fact, serve as a draw for non-black students to, in fact, come to schools in the inner city. The magnet schools were Manual, Mazik, and No. And that program lasted for several years and worked pretty well. And a lot of things were done, a lot of achievements were made. But again, the burden of busing was laid upon black kids from West Louisville. Then we go forward from 1984 to the next big major change was there were some things that happened in the early 90s, 91, 92. But the next big one happened in 2007. And that was when some parents sued the Jefferson County Public School System seeking to end desegregation of the schools. They said their objective was not desegregation of the school, but the way they brought the lawsuit. This lawsuit went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and then it was merited cases. It's styled Merited versus JCPS. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that JCPS could no longer use race as one of the indicia in terms of how students were assigned within the school district. The reason we are at this point, or inflection point, and to regards into education, is that Louisville is one of the most racially segregated cities in America. Believe it or not, when you look at West Louisville, 81% of the people in West Louisville are people of color. Household income is approximately $21,000 per year, and only 7% of residents hold bachelor's degrees. So what we have done through student assignment is attempting to make certain that kids throughout all of Jefferson County get the best education they can. They get a full education in terms of where to the highest levels of their skills and ability. And it has worked, and it has worked really well. You know, I've run through pretty quickly some of that history, but if you're interested in learning more, I would suggest to you that you get this book. It's called From Brown to Merited. It's written by Tracy E. Kmeyer. Tracy is a professor at the University of Louisville, which goes into real details about how the desegregation or student assignment plan came. And I still call it a desegregation plan because that's what it truly was and what it truly is. And she goes through the history, but goes through the history by talking to individuals who lived through those times and were part of it. And so it ends up being very, very important in regards to that. So I would suggest that if you're interested in learning more, read or get Tracy's book. Again, it's From Brown to Merited: The Long Struggle for School Desegregation in Louisville, Kentucky, 1954 to 2007. In 2010, the Louisville branch NAACP on its own commissioned and undertook a white paper on the student assignment plan because we really wanted to know what was going on with student assignment, how was it impacting and affecting individuals, particularly African American students in the community. And we did a very detailed study in regards to that. Copies of this report are available at the NAACP office, and at the end of this program, I'll tell you how to write, request, or call to get a copy of it. But all of these things point to a need for change to take place. Several years ago, as a part of the effort by the State Board of Education to take over Jefferson County Public Schools, one of the things that was included in that agreement was that Jefferson County would undertake a study of its student assignment plan. This was prompted in part by several white legislators in Jefferson County who were opposed to the student assignment plan. It was also a subject of a lawsuit brought by some individuals who wanted to have neighborhood schools restored in our community. And believe it or not, you know, at this day and age, that is in fact an issue. So out of all of those sort of streams of action and consequences, we are arriving at where we are today. And where we are today is Jefferson County Public Schools is looking at its student assignment plan and has put out a proposed plan in terms of what the new student assignment plan should be. And that is what we're going to look at. So when we come back, I'm going to talk in more detail about the Jefferson County student assignment plan, what is included in it, what is not included in it, and things on which this community ought to be aware and in which citizens ought to be raising questions. We'll be right back.
We develop leaders.
You represent who I am, who I have been, and who I can be.
We produce 80% of all Black doctors and dentists.
A community of achievement, one that will demand much of you.
We provide a sense of belonging, a celebration of our unique culture.
That is the magic of this place.
We have teachers that look just like you.
Giving voice to our experiences.
We are the pipeline that produced many of America's Black firsts. first.
But its mission has been to ensure those firsts were not the last.
The nation's VP-elect is a product of this distinct heritage.
I always try to explain to people, when you attend an HBCU, there is nothing you can't do.
We are America's historically black colleges and universities.
Strong enough to support the weight of whatever you could dream.
And proud to be Louisville's only HBCU, Simmons College of Kentucky.
Maybe you have been chosen for such a time as this.
Spring semester is quickly approaching. Classes begin on January 19th. Scholarships and Chromebooks available to those who qualify. Apply today by visiting simmonscollegeky.edu or by texting ADMIT to 55444. We are Simmons College of Kentucky, Louisville's HBCU.
Stop at the beginning of the earlier session. I was talking about the history of student assignment in Jefferson County and what was taking place, giving you that history. Now I want to talk to you about the plan that Jefferson County Public Schools has put out. And the reason we're looking at student assignment in our community is that Louisville is one of, if not the most segregated cities in America, based primarily on housing patterns, housing policy, and based on governmental policies that implemented the housing stratification that we now have in our community. So Jefferson County Public Schools has now put out a new student assignment plan, and this student assignment plan has two components. One relating to how students get assigned to schools, was which one piece. The second piece is it is changing how magnet schools, these are schools that are specifically focused on a particular area, are brought back to.
Oh, let's say keep going.
Brought back how students, magnet schools, how students are attracted to magnet schools and how they undertake activities in those magnet schools. With magnet schools, let me talk about that first, because I'm only going to briefly talk about that. And that is, in the past, with magnet schools, schools have been able to pick and choose their students themselves, meaning that you apply to the school, not through a central system. It also has meant that if there were disciplinary issues or other issues associated with students and performance, the school itself could in fact decide that that student ought to be assigned or taken or moved to another school and basically dismiss those students. Those things will now be taken away, meaning that if you are at a school and a magnet school and you select students, those are your students. You're responsible for their education. You're responsible for their discipline, and you're responsible for making them good learners who take care of what they need to do. But let's talk about the most important part of the student assignment plan. And the student assignment plan is a plan where in the past, students in West Louisville, primarily African American students, have been bused from West Louisville to schools in the East and in the South. What is being proposed in the student assignment plan is what is called dual resides. So currently, based on where you reside, determines whether or not what school you go to. So if you lived in certain parts of West Louisville, your high school could very well have been Ballard High School, or your middle school could have been Camera. What they're now proposing is that students in West Louisville will now have a choice, and they term it choice, a choice to attend a school in your area. And what they're proposing is a renovation and a change to Shawnee High School, and Shawnee High School would become the reside schools for students who reside in West Louisville, and building a new middle school. New middle school has not been built, but where it was taking place. And it would mean that students in West Louisville would have a choice. They could choose to go to either the new middle school or the new high school, to Shawnee, which will be a new high school when they finish the renovation, or you can choose to go to another school, or to the Ballard, Moore, Valley, or any of those particular schools. The real issue that people are asking is, does this choice plan basically provide for a resegregation of schools, or resegregation of schools? And under the old plan, there were indices that were in fact used to determine the what would they call a diversity index, diversity of a school. And if that diversity index was a certain amount and it ranged from 1 to 3, and 1 you were a very highly segregated school, and if you were a 3 you were a desegregated school. We know that in JCPS over the years, that when we look at it, that there have been unevenness in terms of schools being able to perform and being able to do the things that they need to do. This undertaking represents a new chapter and a new process within JCPS. And the question that we all have is, will this resegregate our schools? What is happening with this? What JCPS is proposing, and we have looked around the country trying to find an example of what they are proposing, and does it work? And we have been unable to find that. And I think that part of what JCPS must do as we work within the community is to, in fact, tell us of examples of where this has worked and where resegregation has not taken place. And the reason we ask about resegregation is when you look at the plan that JCPS has put together, and the plan is skimpy in some areas, needing a lot more detail, you do not see in the plan an impact statement. What do I mean by an impact statement? What I mean is determining, by giving a choice to students in West Louisville, what will be the impact on the desegregation or the segregation of schools. And we think that's very important because you need to know. You need to know what the demographics of the school will be, or what you project those demographics will be. You also need to understand what will be the staffing. And at this time, we have a limited amount of information on what has been proposed. And the clearest example that we have that we can relate to what JCPS is proposing, if you go back to, I think it's 1984, I think it was earlier I mentioned, is when JCPS made the changes in terms of busing at that point, elementary schools were exempt. And so the best example that we have of what those schools are and what they can be are elementary schools. In JCPS today, we have 91 elementary schools, and 20 of those schools are outside of the diversity index, meaning that they do not fit within at the index level of 3, which we would like to be, because that says we really have desegregated schools. Most of them are in the 1. And so what we have had happen to us in these schools, or in the elementary schools, and this is the proof of what can actually happen, is that we've had concentrated poverty in those elementary schools. And when I said concentrated poverty, it means that when you look at the poverty indexes, and particularly you look at the percentage of free and reduced lunch students in those schools, they've been concentrated in those schools. One of the things that educators all worry about, and particularly research educators, is that where you have concentrated poverty, you also have other things that take place that requires extra effort to make certain that those students are in fact successful. We find that when we look at those elementary schools, most of them are highly segregated. We also look at them in terms of most of those schools have less resources than their counterparts in the eastern or southern part of the county. And resources end up being very, very important to how well you can in fact impact students who come into a school. One of the things that the NAAC found back when we did our study in 2010 and we looked at those schools is that the elementary schools end up having the less experienced teachers. And what do I mean by the less experienced teacher? They tend to be teachers who are fresh graduates of colleges of education and universities, who are beginning their first years of teaching. And as we all know, in any job, it takes experience to be able to do the job better and to be able to reach individuals to achieve your very best. So when you have the least experienced teachers concentrated in schools, it makes a job very difficult for the superintendent. It makes the job very difficult for the principal teacher, which is the principal in there, in terms of getting teaching and learning taking place. So that we have to be concerned about that. The other thing we have to also be concerned about is that the facilities in these schools tend to be not top-notch facilities. And I use just one example and it's not an elementary school, but to show you. Shawnee High School, which has been around for several years, the top floor in Shawnee High School has been closed, I think, since 1981. We're now doing some renovation. So if you look at that, roughly almost 40 years, near 40 years, the top floor of a school has been closed. And the Shawnee High School is located in the African American community. Now we're doing some renovation and doing some things with Shawnee because we're now talking about a new student assignment plan and we're talking about a tax hike to in fact do that. Resources make a world of difference in terms of schools. Resources determine what takes place. An example, when I talk about resources, PTAs in schools in the eastern part of the county and in the southern part of the county support their schools in a very, very large amount. They are able to, in fact, bring additional resources to bear to supplement what, in fact, comes from the school itself. That means that these students have added advantages, added resources that schools in West Louisville currently today do not have. And the differences in those resources is absolutely striking. I was reading some material at one school, I think it may have been Mill Creek, where the PTA spent something like $1,800 a year in support of where the school was taking place. Whereas a school in the eastern part of the county, the PTA spent $81,000 in support of school. So those difference of resources create problems and issues for us that we ought to be really concerned about. The other thing is that as you look at these schools, not the school themselves, but the student assignment plan, almost every student assignment plan that JCPS has done going back to 1975 has included having it evaluated and studied by professionals who in fact work in this area, who've been involved in school desegregation, who have been involved in student assignment, who in fact understand what the research means and how to apply that research to the school. In the case of this student assignment plan, JCPS has not done that. Has chose not to. In fact, WFPL, local radio station, has quoted or has a segment when they talk to a guy named Gary Orfield, and most of the people who are involved in education who understand school desegregation know the name Gary Orfield. He worked with JCPS on all of his student assignment plan until now. And so when you don't have experts coming in and helping to do what needs to get done, you have to begin to raise questions about that. JCPS's argument, and it is a valid argument, is that its plan provides choice and an option for students near the home. And this is good. And none of us can argue with that, and I won't argue with that. Having a choice that is close to your home is very important in terms of your education and helping you to be and become that which you need to be. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, does that choice alone provide what is necessary for us? And in particular, I'm talking about, it's nice to go to a school next door or across the block or around the corner. But the question is, what's taking place in that school? What's taking place in those classrooms? Are kids excelling? Are they doing well? What is taking place there? So we have to look at the quality of the academics, which are an important part of what is taking place in those schools. And so as we look at these things and we begin to take a longer view of those, we've got to begin to ask our questions. You know, I often say to people, or have said, it's nice having a shiny new building or a shiny new car or a shiny new or whatever, gymnasium, any of those things. But the question is, what's taking place in that school, in that gymnasium from an education standpoint? We all know that there is a significant achievement gap between white and black students in Jefferson County, a significant achievement gap. That achievement gap is not narrowing. It is not narrowing. And that's what we ought to be looking at in terms of where we're taking place. So having a student assignment plan without more, without a commitment and dedication to the resources that are necessary to make each and every student in the classroom successful, then we have nothing. So having choice without any substantive academic educational changes or enhancement is giving us, the community, nothing. You know, the NAACP has not taken a position as it relates to the student assignment plan as of the time that we're recording this. But the NAACP is looking at the plan in more detail, studying it in more detail, because we believe, and what we're more interested in than anything else, is that our students achieve and be successful. When you look at the data and the numbers, that is not occurring in Jefferson County. And we need to be painfully aware of the need to change and do something different to make our students successful. I want every student in Jefferson County to be successful, but in particular, I want every African American and Black student to be successful. And that's the reason the NAACP and I advocate for those things that it push us toward making certain that these students achieve and are successful. The success of our community directly depends on what we are able to do with our students to build our community. As we look around West Louisville, there has been some investment, not a lot of investment, but one of the engines for economic development is education. And so we need an educated populace, an educated group of individuals who need to be able to do and what they need to do. What I'd like to do is share with you now some of my closing thoughts around the student assignment plan and where we go. You know, it's true that when race and poverty are put together, they are systematically unequal. When you put in a building or a place that they're systematically unequal. And what they also are, they're harmful to students. You know, if you look at the WFPL situation, and it talked about student assignment and interviewed people who went through busing in the 1970s and early 80s, some of the things that happened to them should never have happened to any human being or any individual. And it has an impact through their lives, and they now are reflecting that. So if we're going to be successful, if we're going to make a difference in our schools, then we need to make certain that there is accountability in any plan that JCPS brings forward. And by accountability, what I'm talking about is, you know, they're making the improvements to the third floor Shawnee and other improvements. We need to make certain that the resources are committed, they're there, and they will be there in the future. We need to hold individuals accountable for that. We need to ensure that the least experienced teachers are not, in fact, all congregated in the schools in West Louisville, and particularly the two schools who will be the schools of choice. We need the experienced educators who can make a difference and change individual lives and make things work. Even though JCPS and JCTA, the Union for Jefferson County Teachers, have agreed that teachers can get incentive pay to teach in low performing schools, the reality is that has not occurred. And so if we're going to have a student assignment plan that carries a portion called the dual resides, then we got to ensure that the more experienced teachers are in fact in those schools. You know, equity means more than going to a school close to home. Equity means a lot of things, and we've got to be there. And the NAACP and this community needs answers. We need answers from you. We need answers from JCPS. We need answers from Dr. Polio. And the NAACP needs to hear from you. Let us hear from you. And you can contact the NAACP Louisville branch by calling 502-776-7608. We need to hear from you, and the community needs to hear from you, and the schools need to hear from you in regards to the student assignment. Your voice needs to be heard. And I would like to thank you for listening to this program and for us having a chance, and to know to have real change, we must lift every voice. And so we're expecting you to lift your voice and be heard on the new student assignment plan. Thank you. The NAACP was founded in 1909 with the mission to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights of all persons and to eliminate race-based discrimination. It is said that the NAACP is the largest and oldest, the baddest and boldest, the most loved and most hated, the most feared and revered, the most cussed and discussed civil rights organization, and recently its brand was recognized as the most admired organization in America. A heavy recognition to live up to, but that is exactly what the organization does.